Okay, John, can I launch? I don't see people in the room. Yes, we are good to go. Perfect. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to this online seminar of the Illiberalism Studies Program at the George Washington University. My name is Marlène Laruelle. I'm the director of the program and of the Institute, and I'm delighted to receive you today for a great discussion on both kind of historical and contemporary roots of illiberalism. And we will be today trying to go from ancient Greek and Rome to contemporary challenges of Europe, and looking specifically at two key issues. The first one is, in fact, the relationship between illiberalism and populism, or at least the people, and the way it was the concept was developed in ancient time, and today relationship between illiberalism and liberal democracy in its relationship to migration. And I think that's one of the key issues that has been growing in the literature on illiberalism, which is to discuss the fact that even in European liberal democracy, you may sometimes have pockets of illiberalism in the relationship to migration. And so both our topics are kind of very broad in time, but they are also united in a sense around the Mediterranean basin, both north and south, and what is telling us about our own political evolution. And so I have with me today two great colleagues. First, Claudia Moatti, who is specialized in the study of Roman history, Roman administration, and human mobility. And she's today adjunct professor of classics and law at University of Southern California, and also a professor at the Department of History at the University of Paris 8, which is a university I know very well historically. And then our second speaker is Leila Abdu, who is assistant professor at the Migration Policy Center at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute, but she's also based in Vienna, Austria now, and she was in charge of coordinating one of the Horizon 2020 project that was exploring the integration of post-2014 migrant in small and medium-sized town and rural area, and looking at the kind of the community perspective of that. So once again, welcome, and I will now give the floor to Claudia and launch the PowerPoint.
Thank you. Thank you, Marlène. Thank you for inviting me to this workshop. I'm going to speak about a very distant period, but I hope this case study will interest you and be useful to our discussion. In fact, I prepared a PowerPoint in order to allow you to follow better when I speak of Greek or Latin words. I imagine you know them, but I thought it would be more convenient. So in fact, I'm going to speak about Athens and Rome, but at the beginning I will do the both, and progressively I will mainly focus on Rome, which is what I'm studying personally. So how do I switch to the other? Do you
just tell me next, and yes, I will do it.
Next, yes. So this will be the organization of my paper, the definition of the demos and the populus, the powers of the people, the problems of democracy, and the notion of res publica in Rome, and my concept of popularism. Next. So unsurprisingly, there are two meanings of demos and populus, which were common to Athens and Rome. They define first the community of citizens, and in that sense, they both mean the same thing as the city, polis in Greek, and civitas in Latin. There is no idea of a state separated from the citizens. These citizens, as a collectivity, were the sovereign, the source of the law. They voted laws in the assembly, they directly voted laws in the assembly and sat in the courts. In Athens, by metonymy, the word demos referred to the people's assembly itself, the ecclesia. In Rome, the populus could also refer to the popular assemblies, but not as a metonymy of the collectivity, because populus was just one of the three organs of government besides the elected magistrates, coming from a small part of the citizens, and besides the Senate, composed of past and current magistrates. In the sociological context, the term demos referred to the mass of the poor, often seen as disruptive. I remind you that Aristotle defined democracy as the government of the poor. In that context, the demos could easily degenerate into an oikos, a multitude. It's why Aristotle advocated for a moderate democracy, politeia. In the same way, Cicero, the Roman politician in Rome, opposed the libertas of the populus to the licentia of the multitude, which brings the idea of overflow, absence of control, unorganized group. Next. So what was to be a citizen in these cities? The demos and the populus were composed only of male adult citizens, which involved many exclusions, women, slaves, of course, foreign residents. In Rome, there were different degrees of citizenship. We could list long items, active and passive, with suffrage, without suffrage, etc. And this did not exist in Athens. But Rome showed a greater capacity than Athens to open its citizenship to foreigners. Even freedmen could become citizens. The history of Rome is also the history of the increasing number of citizens. Next. So there are, however, big differences. In Athens, there was just one assembly, the ecclesia, and a council, which was the board of the ecclesia, which was called the boule, where each citizen, without any distinction of wealth, could propose a bill and voted individually. This is direct participation, without mediation. The magistrates, chosen by lot or elected for a limited time period, were responsible before the assembly and had to render account of their acts even during the time of their charge. In Rome, there were several popular assemblies, the comitia, where citizens also directly voted laws and elected magistrates. But first, the rights of the citizens were different according to the assembly. One of the assemblies was really hierarchical. Second, the citizen had no initiative. Only magistrates could propose a law to which the citizen will respond by yes or no. Third, the citizens voted within the unit to which they belonged, centuries based on wealth, or tribes, territorial circumscriptions. And the votes were counted by units, hence the invisibility of the number of voters. Let's note that the number of units never changed from the 3rd century BCE on, despite the extension of the civic body over centuries. Hence also, in a way, the invisibility of the new citizens. Next. In that sense, we could say that the notion of populus was more abstract in Rome than in Athens. Another huge difference was that the populus was legally and not only sociologically divided between the ruling elite and the plebs, very heterogeneous in socioeconomic terms. This division was the result of the so-called struggle of the orders between the leading aristocracy, who will be later called patricians, and the rest of the citizens. The plebs did not exist before the struggle. This is very important. The citizens self-instituted themselves as the plebs. The first conflict, which took the form of a secession in 494 BCE, led to the recognition by the ruling elite of specific plebeian institutions, their new magistrates, the tribunes of the plebs, an assembly, the concilium plebis, archives, cults, etc. So the plebs was not only a part of the populus, but a body within the civic body. Next. So the Roman model of the political community presents an absolute singularity, that of a fundamentally discontinuous world which never managed to unify completely under the Republic. The Republic is dated from 509 to 27 BCE. The tribunes, for example, played a considerable role in altering the power of the consuls, the main magistrates of the populus, and they achieved incredible political successes. Conflict was therefore a part of the political game. So I propose a first concept, that of alteronomy, to evoke the revolutionary dynamics of social struggles, the capacity of the plebs to alter values and norms. The Romans themselves recognized that the cessations had had a positive effect on the evolution towards a greater liberty and equality, what Machiavel will discuss in his discourses on Livy's first decade. Next. The struggle of the orders lasted 2 centuries and contributed to the transformation of the city. At the end, from the 3rd century BC on, all citizens were recognized as equal before the law. But the populus also formed a hierarchical society. The system of classes and order institutionalized the superiority of the elite, the patricians and rich plebeians now, and the inferiority of the plebs. The system was based on a proportionality between duties and rights, what Aristotle called a geometrical equality. So now 3 questions must be asked. What was the political and not only institutional role of the populus? What was the political role of the plebs? What kind of city was Rome? Next. Theoretically, the people was the sovereign and directly voted in the assemblies, as I said. But the right to vote is not sufficient to define a popular power. Many problems remain, which has been very much discussed among historians. How many citizens did really participate in the assemblies? What was the influence of the elite on them? There were several responses to these questions in ancient times, and there are today. The most conservatives, like Cicero, the politicians of the 1st century BC, would say, like in the De Republica 240, it was necessary that the greatest number should have the right to vote, but in such a way that they did not constitute a danger. Others, on the contrary, will emphasize the power of the populus and describe the magistrates as under its power. Next. What about the plebs? Did it often take part in the assemblies? According to some modern historians, the plebeians were often missing. They were subjected to the elite and had no political convictions. They follow Cicero, who underlined he again, that the liberty given to the plebs was theoretical. In his book, the De Legibus on the laws, he wrote, liberty was in fact given in such a way that the plebs was induced by many excellent customs to yield to the authority of the first citizens. But this idea has to be revised. Even if the plebs, urban and rural, did not form a homogeneous class, and even if the participation of the plebs was intermittent, the plebs seems to have taken part in the most important debates and played an important political role. It is true that in opposition to the Athenian situation, political contestation did not come directly from the plebs. from the individuals, from the citizens themselves, but from its tribunes of the plebs. They were the ones who carried alteronomy. However, from the 2nd century on, a period which is much more documented, the urban plebs, the plebs domiciliated in the city of Rome, had become a true political actor. The situation indeed changed in the middle of the 2nd century. Refusing the reforms promoted by the tribunes of the plebs, the senators engaged in a terrible repression of these tribunes. They killed or exiled their partisans in the name of the res publica. They did not even respect the judicial laws that forbade to condemn a citizen without a judgment. This attitude led to a polarization of the Roman society into two ideological factions, the conservatives, the optimates, and the reformers, the populares. What is remarkable is that this conflict provoked a change in the conception of the political community. Until this period, the Romans did not think in terms of political regimes, and they did not have a written constitution. The most important concept was the notion of res publica, literally the public thing, with its indetermination. It can be defined as all the set of affairs that the citizens share and that resulted from their interactions, whether harmonious or conflicting. The Romans originally indeed conceived the public sphere as potentially conflictual. In the 2nd century, while the reformers referred to this notion, this traditional notion of res publica, illustrated by the memory of the cessations, the struggle of the orders, the optimates idealized the res publica, whose defense and majesty were considered as more important than the civil and political rights of the citizens. The notion of populus was also idealized, clearly detached from the tumultuous plebs. It is what we find in Cicero's definition. For him, the people was a kind of corporation, a legal category based on consensus. This is his famous definition. The public thing, the res publica, is the thing of the people. The people is not just any gathering of men assembled in a certain way, but the gathering of a multitude whose association is based on legal organization, juris consensu, and the community of interest. The same Cicero wrote a book on the best political regime and proposed a kind of written constitution for the future in his book on the laws. Next, from this time also, the reforming plebeian tribunes started being referred to as populares or seditious. In fact, the word popularis designated originally what concerned the people. The Greek democracy was translated into popularis res publica, the power of the people. It also designated someone who had the interests of the people at heart. And now it began to point to a demagogue. So Cicero could say, I am the best popularis, I care about the people, but at the same time, he would denounce the demagogy of the reformers, the populares. In most of its uses, the word popularis was thus a part of a discursive and ideological strategy aimed at accusing opponents of wanting to take power, to rely on the plebs without respecting the mediation of the Senate, and then to threaten the res publica. But this accusation of demagogy was really unfair. If we look at the speech of the tribunes and their actions, with in mind the ancient notion of res publica. The tribunes were fighting for the defense of the civil and political rights of the plebs. They did not want to change the institutions, they did not contest the laws, on the contrary. but they claimed the ancient conception of the Respublica, according to which conflicts belonged to the public sphere. Second, they never tried to present themselves as embodying the people or speaking in its name. They never tried to oppose the plebs to the foreigners. On the contrary, they initiated or supported the project of integration of the Italians, who were not citizens at that time, in the Roman citizenship. It's why I propose to speak about them. I propose the concept of popularism. So let me define this notion. This proposal has nothing to do with the recent use of the word by the French sociologist Jean-Gustave Padiolo to qualify the fact that a neoliberal leader, the fact for a neoliberal leader to respond to political problems with managerial measures, reducing politics to business and the people to a crowd of consumers. Popularism could, on the contrary, be first defined as a reforming political program. In that sense, it must be distinguished from demagogy. I don't use populism because it's too anachronistic. And second, it's defined as a program based on ideology of democratic nature, which stated that what concerns the plebs has to be ruled by the plebs in the legal assemblies and neither in the streets nor in the Senate. I conclude, what is at the heart of popularism is not the unity of an abstract people, nor the extra-legal means of actions, but on the contrary, the defense of the political role of the plebs as a body within the body politic, and therefore the defense of political plurality and even of a kind of differentiated citizenship in the strict continuity of the plebeian secessions. In Rome, this conception was challenged by the optimates, the conservatives, who advocated for the unity of the populus and of the Respublica, whose defense could potentially relegate the rights of the citizen to the second place. Such a conception of a unified and nearly transcendent Respublica and of an abstract and legal populus became that of Augustus and of the following emperors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was terrific. And as you can imagine, I have, as someone studying contemporary issue, I see a lot of parallels arriving, and they are largely probably kind of, misreading or applied kind of history. But I think what you are bringing there, the kind of the dissociation between demos and populus, this ancient notion of Respublica, the place where conflicts belong to the public sphere, it resonates, with all of those who know the literature on populism, the debates we have, kind of Chantal Mouffe discussion on conflict being the norm of a democratic body and so on. So there are a lot of resonance happening with between what you just said and the contemporary situation. Before we move to the discussion, and we will keep that, I want to give the floor to Leila for her presentation. And then after we will have time for the discussion. I think I have, yes. You should be able to share your screen. Yes, perfect.
Okay, fine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to make it full screen. Yes. Yeah, so thanks so much also to you, Marlene, and to John for organizing and inviting. And I want to send very warm regards also to my favorite city in the world, which is Washington, D.C., which is partly related to migration, namely my own migration, and I have to say also to your students and maybe to your audience that I never felt as home anywhere in the world, not even in the country where I was born. So it's an extreme pleasure to be here with you today and talk exactly about this, namely migration and the politicization of migration and the rise of illiberal democracy. I wanted to start with a quote, and namely a quote that is now aged more than a decade, but it didn't age content-wise. Namely Ivan Krastev, who said in The Strange Death of the Liberal Consensus, populism is the new condition of the political, with elites becoming ever more suspicious of democracy and angry publics becoming ever more hostile to liberalism. And the rise of populism and the illiberal term, what I framed the illiberal term here, migration and migrant rights are really a key issue, as I try to outline in the following minutes. So we have seen definitely, and I think this is without controversy, the rise of populism, this illiberalism turn, but also what we have to emphasize that it was not always like that, of course. Before we have seen this illiberal turn in the domain of migration, what we have seen very much is what the American scholar Gary Freeman called clientelist politics in the field of migration politics. Namely, that migration was rather dealt in a liberal manner for the sake that policymakers catered to business interests rather to the preferences of concerned citizens. Then also what we see, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the global north, is the role of courts, right, that really fought through migrant rights and the expansion of liberal rights. What I find particularly interesting also from a European Union perspective is that when we see how the policy field evolved at the European Union level is that interior ministers who were restrictive minded initially went to the EU level to push through restrictive policies which they saw more and more opposition at the national level, in the national arena through civil society. They wanted to push through their more restrictive policies there, but this plan badly backfired because what we saw with the spirit of European integration was really more migrant rights. Famous example is also rights of family reunification, also in the domain of irregular migrants. So really saw a phase of an expansion of the rights of immigrants. But then, of course, this era, we can say, has come to some end with the politicization of migration. I just give you here some two examples. One is, you might recall, was from the British context, was a former UKIP campaign. The other one now more recent from the Italian context with Giorgia Meloni as the prime minister. So what we really see starting with the fall of the Iron Curtain, 1989, is this increased politicization of migration, which changed these dynamics for good. And the illiberal turn, and also which touched upon very much about migrant rights, has to be understood in political science terms as a new political cleavage structure that has reshaped the political space in Europe. So as I said, that this is really driven by this new cleavage structure. Let's go back before these technical difficulties. What my point was that in order to understand the politicization, we have to understand also that there emerged like new grievances within the population, which didn't work anymore across the left versus right spectrum. And here, what we also know that education is the biggest predictor here of people who are more cosmopolitan or less or more communitarian, in the sense that they are for more open borders, open migration, are the segments of society with higher education normally, and with lower education, we see that they're more skeptical of migration. So, and also what we know that the anti-migration electorate or anti-migrant electorate is really less politically trusting and more dissatisfied with the way democracy works, and much more likely to support non-democratic alternatives. So this is just also brand new research by Swedish colleagues, which really showed in a Kokon and Linde in a very nice paper, that really, in order to understand support for the populist radical right, the anti-migration attitude is crucial also for attitudes towards democracy. And the populists exploit these new cleavages and new grievances because they mobilize the people along these new conflict lines beyond left and right. I think one of the best authors still, in order to understand the rise of populism, is still Margaret Canavan, who framed these very nice explanations of populism, who said populism follows democracy like a shadow, because the liberal principle of liberal democracy limits the democratic principle and vice versa, of course. But so the people, the will of the people is constrained by the liberal principles, by like universal rights and other safeguards. So this is also how we can understand how democracy, populism could rise, especially within the framework of illiberal democracy. What we can see, and unfortunately what you don't see now, is a nice slide I prepared about the 2015 migration crisis, where you can very nicely see that the scope of politicization increased with the migration crisis very differently, although across Europe, especially in southern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, we see a huge impact of the migration crisis and how the issue of migration was politicized. This was less so the case in North and Western Europe, because there already levels of politicization were very high. But what does this mean now? And this is a point I would try to get across. Does more politicization also mean overall more negative political opinion? And actually, when you look really across time, what we can see, and here I also brought you some data, that attitudes to migration are actually relatively stable, and that they were even becoming slightly more positive in Europe post the 2015 migration crisis. So the rise of populism isn't explained by that the public opinion, the publics become more hostile to migration, but what really explains it a great deal is the salience, that because migration is so much spoken about, is so much an issue in public debate, that it really brings those to the voting booth who already had silent or dormant concerns about migration. This is how we can understand this rise of populist anti-migrant parties. But I think then again, when you think in terms of policies and the rise of illiberalism in the field of migration policy, we also have to understand that policymakers have a quite biased understanding of the public opinion. And studies show that really politicians believe to be the people's position, what politicians believe are the positions of the people is one of the most important drivers of the representative behavior. But here they have rather right-wing bias, so they think that the public opinion is much more towards the right than it basically is. This is also how we can understand in terms of the effects of the politicization, that we really see a much more restrictive term when it comes to policies, or what a legal scholar, Stephen Pearce, has even called the urbanization of EU migration policies. We see a heightened focus on prevention of migration, control of migration and return migration in Europe. And also what we see more and more in the field, also in the European Union, is an informalization of migration agreements. And this means also in terms of democracy and evasion of democratic accountability. I brought you a slide about Sweden, because Sweden always in public debate is the paradigmatic example of a liberal country in terms of migration. And here also, even this country, which has been framed as one of the most liberal, has seen a shift towards much more restrictive policies. And I think in terms of democracies, what we also see in the field of the migration policy field is externalization, meaning that, for instance, agreements with states which go back quite some time now, like Libya, Tunisia, latest also with the UK now, with Rwanda, So which create like legal black holes where democratic norms of and protection of migrant rights do not apply. And here also, so this is really in terms of what it means in terms of democracy, also quite troubling. And also another side, that this cooperation with the states has legitimized illiberal regimes in transit on the origin countries. Just think of the Gaddafi regime back at the time, with the migration regimes, or the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia at the time, but also, as I mentioned, also newer examples might be also Turkey. There is also, of course, the constraints of making agreements and the externalizing migration control, and this is especially the resistance by African states who don't want to play along. I want to end here, and I want to say that also, given all these developments in the field, we might think that this illiberal turn is particularly problematic when we think about migrant rights. But what I want to highlight, that it's not only a threat to liberalism and migrant rights, but it's a threat to democracy more general. Why? And here I side with Jan Werner Müller and this literature that really derives this narrative of the people by the populists, that this is really about feeling majorities, as Jan Werner Müller puts it, because those who don't agree with the anti-migrant populist discourse are presented as being not part of the people. So it's not really about counting majorities as it should be in democracies. It's really about these feeling majorities, who is with us and who is against us, which totally conceals also different political interests within the demos. And also, last but not least, which we have seen also across Europe and even more so in the United States, rising political polarization that make democracies especially vulnerable. Yeah, I stop here, and I hope you still could follow.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you so much. And we apologize. I think, I mean, could have been also on our side, that because it seems we have been or are getting hacked. So who knows? But thank you so much for these two great presentations. There are several questions that have come. So let me begin by maybe asking you, each of you, one question, and then hopefully we have time for a second round of a question. Claudia, a question from our colleague, Grant Silverman, asking you, so when you mentioned the classical conception of the state being impossible to divorce from the people, how is this formulation mirrored in the contemporary effort by radical extremists to create so-called communities, right? This idea that now kind of far-right groups should live in communities as a kind of microstate, right, with its own laws and regulations. So that's one question. And a second one that we have also for you, Claudia, do you see parallels between the use of the term Popularis and the free use of the term populist in our present day as an epithet? And then, yeah, a really big question. Leila, a question for you, if you could try to, on your last point, the polarization between kind of who is considered as being this kind of feeling majority and who is kind of considered outside. How do you see the articulation between this kind of anti-migrant aspect and the kind of more conservative values, kind of traditional family? So how is the moral aspect and the migration, or the family and the nation parallel, articulated by the kind of illiberal groups? How is the nation supposed threatened by the migrant kind of put in parallel with the family threatened by kind of progressive more? Do you see that as also a kind of key element that is going in favor of what you were saying, that it's not just about migrants, it's really about democracy and rights and a much more global level? Let's begin with that. Claudia, I give you the floor for these two questions, and then Leila after.
Yes. About the first question, it's very interesting, in fact, but I think we have to relate this question to the problem of to the definition of democracy and the debate between those who are in favor of direct democracy and those who are in favor of representation with a great variety of ideas about representation. But there is first this, according to me, this old debate, actually, if we refer, for example, to Rousseau, who thought that a democracy could not exist with representation, so who advocated for direct participation, which means precisely that there is no distinction between the collectivity and the state. Direct participation means that the citizens make the state. So there, I remember also all the debate between Castoriadis and the new reflection on democracy by Laclos and Chantal Mouffe, which is about this problem of absence or presence of representation. So we have here a long debate about this issue, which is in part the reference for these new communities. Communities are referring to a possibility of directing, organizing their life with their own rules, and it's a specific conception of democracy. This, so I think this is the first response to make to this problem, to this question. That said, to think in terms of, I would say, self-segregation, to use a word which is used in America, it's also a second. It's also has to do with also the approach in terms of multiculturalism, communitarism, which is a second problem. So I think we have to think. We have to link these two questions. The first one is the conception of democracy. Is it possible to skip representation? And the second point is the conception of the social of the social fabric. Is it possible just to imagine that the society is composed of specific communities with their own rules? And the two questions are linked together. Well, I cannot respond directly, but I think these are the two questions which are involved in. We can discuss more on that. The second question was about populism. Could you repeat the question? Is it?
Yes. Do you see parallels between the use of the term popularis and the free use of the term populism in our present day as a kind of negative insult?
I don't think populism refers to popularism, but rather to it's the root of the word is populus, in the sense of the population rather. And when I first used the word popularism, I thought I invented a concept, but in fact it's not the case. Many people now refer to popularism to differentiate a democratic, for example, to differentiate a democratic and a demagogic approach to the problem. So, but I don't think that in the development of the term populism, there is a reference to the Popularis.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Really important semantic point. Leila.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is a very good question about these different streams within the radical right, populist radical right. So indeed, it differs about the emergence of and the family of the radical right. So you have some currents which are very much what I call have a perspective on anti-gender equality, but also anti-LGBTQ norms. So which is, for instance, the Austrian populist radical right, which is one of the strongest, as have always been traditionally here, is one of these examples. And as you rightly mentioned in the question, the Netherlands has been very different. So I think some populist radical right parties, because I think it either way it works, because even in those who are very gender conservative, they also sometimes use this argument that migrants are not are against gender equality or against LGBTQ rights, because it works either way, because it's a method of to demarcate the other, right? And it's also, so I find this argument very interesting when you think of nationalism, that it was not the issue was that the Jewish other, so to say, could not integrate into the national project. Here nowadays, when it's about the Muslim other, for instance, which often it's substituted with the migrant other, that he or she cannot integrate into the European project. And the European project here is defined as by universal rights, right? By gender equality, by liberalism, liberal norms. So that's it. So in the end, it's another form of demarcation of othering, which is also connected to different political projects or different times, versus the nation state project, and now much more post-national projects like the European Union, but still very much connected to an exclusionary identity. So, but also, as you see in Hungary, which is a very nice example also, where really Europe and the identity is defined as Christianism and as illiberal, right? In the sense, so, but still this is what Europe, it's the connection is not to the nation state, but to Europe defined through Christianity.
Thank you so much. And I think we have time very briefly for, yeah, Claudia, you wanted to add something.
Just to return to the first question, I think the problem is the articulation between the populus and the plebs. So we can imagine plebeian and communities rules, but within a larger sphere, because if we don't have this sphere of the populus, of course, it's just a juxtaposition of different plebs, and it cannot work. We need a common sphere. So the problem is rather the articulation between the two words, the two worlds, I would say.
Very good point, thank you. And very briefly, maybe on two questions that one for each of you that in fact are interconnected. Claudia, you had this really interesting element explaining that in the Roman case, there was a way for foreigners and freedmen to integrate. So it was a kind of open, right, citizenship and citizenry with different kind of status. So the boundaries were kind of expanding. And so one of the questions is the relationship between that kind of more inclusive citizenship and the notion of the Roman culture as an empire, the Roman Empire, like absorbing other culture and being open. So that's one question. And Leila also related to this question of othering. So how would you, and I mean, it's really a big question, how would you see the kind of contradiction between Europe liberalism for itself, in a sense, and partnering with illiberal for the minimal version of them, of Mediterranean country like Turkey or Libya? So how is this exclusionary aspect kind of putting into question the internal EU kind of liberalism, right? So liberalism for ourselves and kind of exclusionary for the other. Is that a feature that you see as a kind of growing one for mostly kind of securitization of the narrative on migration? So yeah, two broad questions, and we have only a few minutes. Claudia.
Yes, in fact, there is a traditional opposition between Athens, which is close to itself, and Rome, which is an open city. And in fact, it has been the case. We know several steps of openness until the Constitution of Caracalla in 212, which gave the Roman citizenship to all the free inhabitants of the empire. So it's a true question. How do you understand the relationship between the extension of the empire and this inclusion? There are several responses. But I think what we could say is the Romans did not think in terms of identity. They thought in terms of law first and power. So the problem was more hegemony. And one of the ideas in ancient time was the most important was the demography. The most important, the stronger was the state. So the more important was the demography, the stronger was the state. It's why, and it is said very clearly in some texts where we have to bring the strength of other cities to Rome. But on the other side, the openness is linked to absorption. Absorption, which means the disappearance of the other's identities in a way, or I would not say that, the indifference to either identity. And the Roman Empire was in a way, is absorbing in order to dominate. This is just the point. The Roman citizenship was given originally in order to deprive a city of its identity. So once a city became Roman, it was no more free, independent, sovereign. So there is always this scope of being the only one to dominate. So how do you do that? By including people. This is really smart. So it worked very well in a way because it associated the elite, the local elites, to the government of Rome. So the idea was not to expand Romanes, which did not, it has no sense, it does not exist, but at least to expand the Roman domination by inclusion. Yes.
That's a great point. Thank you so much. Leila.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think your question is really indeed tricky because it's indeed not only a very big one, but also because things are a little bit more complex, I would say. The first one is, like me being also truly Democrat, I think there is an issue, right? That of course, public opinion should count, right? And if it's only going to advocating certain interests, we have a democracy problem, right? And also as democracy scholars like Platten always say that democracy is always a calibrating act between the liberal and the democratic element. So both have to be respected. So if one goes out of balance, so we have, then we have a problem, so to say. So I think, of course, preferences of the public should count in the terms. But what I wanted to highlight in my talk is that often what the public thinks is much more nuanced and there is much more middle segments rather than on the both extreme ends, right? So I think that's the first point I want to make and which we have to bear in mind. And the second point, when you asked me about this, is Europe giving away its internal credibility, so to say, when it acts with other illiberal actors in order to prevent migration? Again, here, I think we can't speak of the European Union as an homogeneous bloc. And I think many actors within the European Union are very well aware, right, that this would be a one-sided agenda. And that in order also to be seen as a credible actor on the international scene, this would be much too narrow focused how international relations are maintained. So there is not one voice also within the European Union, but of course certain actors have a certain one-sided agenda. But again, here we have to be much more nuanced. And then it's also those they are partnering with, these are also not homogeneous blocks, right? There is also different currents, different streams who also oppose illiberal preferences or oppose also that European migration agenda put on them. So I think, again, it's much more complex than an easy story of good and bad.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a nice way to conclude our seminar. I wanted to thank you, both of you, for your great presentation and this contribution to the discussion and the chapter you had on the Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism are really important. So thank you all of you for being with us today, and we hope to see you. We have another event arriving next week to continue discussing illiberalism and far right in Europe. So thank you again for being with us today, and thank you, Claudia and Leila, for a great presentation.